The Magical Monkey's Paw, Part 1. Outside, it was a cold and wet night, but inside the cozy little living room of Laburnum Villa, the blinds were drawn and the fire was burning brightly. Mr. White and his son Herbert were playing chess. Mr. White liked to take risky moves, which often led to trouble, and tonight was no different. Mrs. White, knitting by the fire, occasionally looked up and smiled at their game. "Listen to the wind," said Mr. White, trying to distract Herbert from a mistake he had made. "I'm listening," said Herbert, moving a piece on the board. "Check." "I don't think he'll come tonight," said Mr. White, hesitating over the board. "Mate," replied Herbert, ending the game. "That's the problem with living so far out," Mr. White complained suddenly. "This place is terrible. The path is muddy, and the road is flooded. Only 2 houses on this road are occupied. It's like no one cares." "Never mind, dear," said his wife gently. "Maybe you'll win the next game." Mr. White looked up quickly and caught a knowing glance between his wife and son. He smiled and hid his grin in his beard. "There he is," said Herbert as they heard the gate bang and footsteps approaching the door. Mr. White got up quickly to welcome the visitor. Soon, he returned with a tall, burly man named Sergeant Major Morris. The Sergeant Major shook hands with everyone and took a seat by the fire. Mr. White brought out some whiskey, and after a few glasses, the Sergeant Major began to talk about his adventures in faraway places. He spoke of wars, strange lands, and mysterious people. 21 years of it," said Mr. White, nodding to his wife and son. "When he left, he was just a boy working in the warehouse. Now look at him. He doesn't look like he's been harmed," said Mrs. White politely. "I'd love to go to India myself," said Mr. White, "just to see the sights." "Better stay where you are," said the Sergeant Major, shaking his head. He put down his empty glass and sighed. "I'd like to see those old temples and fakirs," Mr. White continued. "What was that story you were telling me about a monkey's paw, Morris?" "Nothing important," said the Sergeant Major quickly. "Just a bit of magic, I suppose." "Monkey's paw?" said Mrs. White curiously. The Sergeant Major hesitated, then took something out of his pocket. It was a dried, shriveled monkey's paw. Mrs. White made a face, but Herbert took it and looked at it curiously. "What's special about it?" asked Mr. White, taking it from Herbert and examining it before putting it on the table. "It had a spell put on it by an old fakir," said the Sergeant Major. "He wanted to show that fate rules people's lives, and those who try to change it will be sorry. The spell allows 3 different men to each have 3 wishes." His manner was so serious that the little family fell silent. "Why don't you wish for something?" said Herbert. "I have," said the Sergeant Major quietly, his face pale. "And were your wishes granted?" asked Mrs. White. "They were," said the Sergeant Major, and he tapped his glass against his teeth. "And did anyone else wish?" asked Mrs. White. "The first man had his 3 wishes, yes," said the Sergeant Major. "I don't know what his first 2 wishes were, but the third was for death. That's how I got the paw." A hush fell over the room. "If you've had your 3 wishes, it's no good to you now then," said Mr. White. "Why do you keep it?" The Sergeant Major shook his head. "Fancy, I suppose," he said slowly. "I thought of selling it, but I don't think I will. It has caused enough trouble already. Besides, people think it's just a story. Those who believe it want to try it first and pay me later." "If you could have another 3 wishes," asked Mr. White, "would you take them?" "I don't know," said the Sergeant Major. "I don't know." He dangled the paw between his thumb and finger and suddenly threw it into the fire. With a cry, Mr. White quickly snatched it out. "Better let it burn," said the sergeant major seriously. "If you don't want it, give it to me," said Mr. White. "I won't," said the sergeant major firmly. "I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't blame me for what happens. Throw it back in the fire, like a sensible man." Mr. White shook his head and examined his new possession closely. "How do you use it?" he asked. "Hold it up in your right hand and wish aloud," said the sergeant major. "But I warn you of the consequences." "Sounds like something out of the Arabian Nights," said Mrs. White. "Why don't you wish for 4 pairs of hands for me?" Mr. White took the paw from his pocket, and the family laughed as the sergeant major grabbed his arm with a look of alarm. "If you must wish," said the sergeant major gruffly, "wish for something sensible." Mr. White put the paw back in his pocket, and they all sat down for supper. The monkey's paw was almost forgotten as the sergeant major continued to tell stories about India. After dinner, the sergeant major left to catch the last train, and Herbert joked about the monkey's paw as the door closed behind their guest. "Did you pay anything for it?" asked Mrs. White, looking closely at her husband. "A little," said Mr. White, coloring slightly. "He didn't want to take it, but I made him. And he told me again to throw it away." "Likely story," said Herbert with a laugh. "We're going to be rich and famous now. Wish to be an emperor, father, so you can't be boss around." Mr. White took the paw from his pocket and looked at it doubtfully. "I don't know what to wish for. It seems like we have everything we need." "Wish for 200 pounds to clear the house," said Herbert. "That would do it." Smiling at his own foolishness, Mr. White held up the paw. Herbert, with a solemn face, gave his father a wink and played a dramatic chord on the piano. "I wish for 200 pounds, said Mr. White clearly. There was a sudden crash from the piano, and Mr. White let out a startled cry. His wife and son rushed to his side. "It moved," he said, looking at the paw with disgust. "As I made the wish, it twisted in my hand like a snake." "Well, I don't see the money," said Herbert, picking up the paw and putting it back on the table. "And I bet I never will." "It must have been your imagination, Mr. White," said Mrs. White, watching him closely. He shook his head. "Never mind, there's no harm done. But it gave me a shock." They sat by the fire again, and the two men finished their pipes. Outside, the wind was louder, and Mr. White jumped nervously at the sound of a door banging upstairs. A strange, depressing silence fell over the room, lasting until the couple went to bed. "I expect you'll find the money tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed," said Herbert, "with something horrible watching you from the wardrobe." He sat alone in the darkness, watching the fire. As it died down, he saw strange faces in it. One face became so horrible that he reached out for a glass of water to throw on the fire, but his hand touched the monkey's paw instead. He shivered, wiped his hand on his coat, and went up to bed. The Magical Monkey's Paw, Part 2. The next morning, in the bright winter sunlight, Herbert laughed at his fears. The room looked cheerful, and the monkey's paw lay carelessly on the sideboard. "All old soldiers are the same," said Mrs. White. "How could wishes be granted in these days? And if they were, how could 200 pounds hurt you?" "It might drop on his head from the sky," joked Herbert. "Morris said things happen so naturally," said Mr. White, "that you could call it coincidence." "Don't spend the money before I get back," said Herbert as he prepared to leave for his job. "I'm afraid it'll turn you into a greedy old man." His mother laughed and watched him down the road. She then returned to the breakfast table, still smiling at her husband's foolishness. But when the postman knocked, she hurried to the door, hoping for news. Instead, she received a bill from the tailor. "Herbert will have something funny to say about this," she said at dinner. "I dare say," said Mr. White, pouring himself some beer. "But the paw moved in my hand, and I'll swear to." "You thought it did," said his wife soothingly. "It did," replied Mr. White firmly. "What's the matter?" Mrs. White was watching a man outside, who seemed unsure about approaching the house. He was well dressed and wore a new silk hat. After hesitating several times, he finally opened the gate and walked up the path. Mrs. White brought the visitor inside. He seemed uncomfortable and picked at his trousers as he spoke. "I was asked to call," he said at last, "from Ma and Megan's." Mrs. White started. "Is anything wrong?" she asked breathlessly. "Has something happened to Herbert? What is it?" "I'm sorry," began the visitor. "Is he hurt?" demanded Mrs. White. The visitor nodded. "Badly hurt, but he is not in any pain." "Oh, thank God," said Mrs. White. "Thank God for that." She stopped as she realized the full meaning of his words. She saw the truth in the visitor's face and turned to her husband, laying her trembling hand on his. There was a long silence. "He was caught in the machinery," said the visitor softly. "Caught in the machinery," repeated Mr. White, dazed. The visitor continued, "The firm wishes to express their sympathy in your great loss. I am only following orders." There was no reply. Mrs. White's face was white, and her husband's expression was one of shock. "Ma and Megan's accept no responsibility," the visitor went on. "But in consideration of your son's services, they wish to give you a certain sum as compensation." Mr. White let go of his wife's hand and asked, "How much?" £200, said the visitor. Mrs. White screamed, and Mr. White fainted. The Magical Monkey's Paw, Part 3. In the new cemetery, 2 miles away, the couple buried their son. They returned home to a house filled with shadows and silence. It all happened so quickly that they could hardly believe it. They waited for something to lighten the heavy burden on their hearts. But days passed, and hope gave way to resignation. They hardly spoke, as there was nothing left to talk about, and their days seemed endless. About a week later, Mr. White woke up in the night and found himself alone. The room was dark, and he heard his wife crying softly by the window. He called her back to bed, but she replied, "It's colder for my son," and wept again. Her sobs faded, and Mr. White fell into a restless sleep. He was awakened by a wild cry from his wife. "The paw!" she cried. "The monkey's paw!" Mr. White was alarmed. "Where is it? What's the matter?" "I want it," she said. "You haven't destroyed it, have you?" "It's in the parlor on the shelf," he answered. "Why?" She cried and laughed at the same time, then kissed his cheek. "I just thought of it," she said. "Why didn't I think of it before?" "Why didn't you?" "Think of what?" he asked. "The other 2 wishes," she said. "We've only used one." "Wasn't that enough?" he demanded. "No," she said. "We'll have one more. Go get it quickly and wish our boy alive again." Mr. White shook with fear. "Good God, you're mad!" he cried. "Get it," she panted. "Get it quickly and wish." "Oh, my boy, my boy." Her husband lit a candle and told her to go back to bed. "You don't know what you're saying." "We had the first wish granted," said Mrs. White. "Why not the second?" A coincidence, said Mr. White. Go get it and wish, insisted his wife. Mr. White hesitated. He's been dead 10 days. Besides, I could only recognize him by his clothes. If you couldn't see him then, how will it be now? Bring him back, cried Mrs. White. Do you think I fear my own child? Mr. White went down in the darkness and found the paw on the shelf. He was afraid the wish might bring his mutilated son back. Cold with sweat, he groped his way back to the living room. Even his wife's face seemed changed. She looked white and expectant, with an unnatural expression. He was afraid of her. Wish, she cried in a strong voice. It is foolish and wicked, he said. Wish, repeated his wife. He raised his hand. I wish my son alive again. The paw fell to the floor, and Mr. White watched it fearfully. Then he sank into a chair as his wife walked to the window and raised the blind. They sat in silence, listening to the ticking clock. A stair creaked, and a mouse scurried through the wall. The darkness was oppressive. After a while, Mr. White took the box of matches and went downstairs for a candle. At the foot of the stairs, he dropped the matches and heard a quiet knock at the door. He stood still, his breath held, until the knock was repeated. He turned and ran back to the living room, closing the door behind him. A third knock echoed through the house. What's that? Cried Mrs. White. A rat, said Mr. White, his voice shaking. A rat. It passed me on the stairs. His wife sat up in chair, listening. A loud knock sounded through the house. It's Herbert, she cried, running to the door. Mr. White was before her, holding her tightly. What are you going to do? He whispered. It's my boy. It's Herbert, she cried. Let go. I must open the door. For God's sake, don't let it in, cried Mr. White. You're afraid of your own son, she said, struggling. Let me go. I'm coming, Herbert. There was another knock. Mrs. White broke free and ran downstairs. Mr. White heard the chain rattle and the bolt slowly drawn. The bolt, she cried. Come down. I can't reach it. Back at the living room, Mr. White was on his hands and knees, searching for the paw. He had to find it before the thing outside got in. He heard the bolt creaking and finally found the paw. Frantically, he made his third and last wish. The knocking stopped suddenly. He heard his wife open the door, and a cold wind blew through the house. He heard her cry of disappointment and ran to her side. The street outside was quiet and empty. The road was deserted, and the only light came from a flickering street lamp. This adaptation is based on a short story, The Monkey's Paw, by W.W. Jacobs. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to the channel for more updates and stories like this.